So for those of you who joined our conversation, as you can see, we've already started talking. I am I'm Lisa Osborne Ross, the U.S. CEO of Edelman. If you are new to this series, thank you for joining. If you are a veteran, thank you for coming back and starting the new year with us. A few things about the new year, because it's actually crystallized in the conversation I'm going to have with Stella and with Ella. I wrote to my team, this is going to be a year where we just say, come what may. Come what may. We're going to be ready for it. We're going to deal with it. We don't know what it is, but we're just going to embrace whatever comes our way, make the most of it, enjoy it, deal with it, and move it and keep it moving. So I wanted to share that with you before I introduce these two remarkable women that in the short period of time that we've talked have already inspired me and given me some direction and counsel on how to be my most authentic self, because that's what they are and what they do in their most authentic self. So without further ado, Happy New Year and welcome to Ella Bell Smith, Professor of Business Administration of Tuck School of Business at Dartmouth, and her ace boon coon best friend, ride or die partner, Stella Nkomo, who is the professor in the Department of Human Resource Management in the Faculty of Economic and Management Sciences at the University of Pretoria. And Ella and Stella have co-authored our conversation topic today, Our Separate Ways, Black and White Women and the Struggle for Professional Identity. So as I said to you all before, I actually had people calling me about this one. They were like, I cannot wait. I'm taking notes and I need some help navigating and so forth and so on. So start first by telling me why you first decided to write about this book, when you decided to write about it, and why we're having this conversation now.
Stella, you want me to take the first part?
You can go.
Oh, okay.
Come in.
You can come in and finish it up. Yeah. Because why we're having the conversation now is so incredibly important. But we actually started this conversation. The book came out 20 years ago. We actually started this process 30 years ago. We got this idea because everything we knew about women in management happened to be about white women. We were both in business schools. You could count the number of Black women on faculty in business schools on one hand, and we all knew each other. Mm-hmm. And at that time, there was so much research coming out on women in management, and none of it discussed Black women. And that was troublesome. And it also mirrored our experiences in our work life, where we were loners, solos, and just, nobody to help guide us. We were fortunate, some of us, to have some very strong mentors. I had Clay Aldifer at Yale, but basically you were on your own. And we got this idea. We wanted to talk about Black women in management and how they got there, because it was so rare for women to be in management in those days. Okay. Mm-hmm. Mind you, 30 years back, okay, women were not in great numbers, Black or white women, in the corporate world. Mm-hmm. So we really wanted to understand how Black women got there. We really wanted to understand not only Black women, but Hispanic women and Asian American women. And the grants that we applied for at the Rockefeller Foundation, particularly the Rockefeller Foundation, said, your span is too wide. We'd really like you to focus your research. We want to fund you, but we want you to focus on Black men and Black women. And, I looked at Stella and said, we're not going that path, because they always want you to look at Black men and Black women. I was like, I have no interest in that. Let's give them an alternate proposal. Let's do white women. And we had a cross-racial team to interview the white women. We interviewed 120 women. We oversampled for African-American women because there was nothing on this population. in terms of their life histories. We did a quantitative and qualitative approach. We were interested in gathering their life stories. We have 10-hour interview data. We had so much data, it was ridiculous. The Ford Foundation gave us money, and the schools that we were at also gave us money. It took us 10 years to collect the data and to analyze the data. We went through 2 publishers, and finally Harvard Business Press picked us up. We had to get a creative writer. We were staunch academics in those days. So we wrote a research report. Research reports do not sell books. So it came out right before, 1 month before 9/11. And the conversation in our country changed.
Yeah, yeah.
It was not about race at all. In fact, it was about we have come together in the face and the eye of the enemy. We did get good press. We did sell good books, a number of books. But the reality was the conversation for the time for the conversation we're having now was not the right time.
So that gets to the second point. Why now, Lisa?
Yeah.
In fact, in this edition, we wrote a new preface, and what we talk about is a mega storm, because we say, like, I call it intersecting viruses, in the sense that, the pandemic hit us in 2020, and we were working on the book, and we had let me go back. We had approached Harvard earlier than we actually got the contract to do the book, and they thought, well, do a new book. But then things changed dramatically in 2020 in several ways. First of all, the pandemic. The second thing, of course, was the murder of George Floyd.
Right.
And so the book is came out in a very different time, where America in particular fractured race relations, right? Systemic racism, racial injustice, Black Lives Matter. And we could see how racial inequality was now on people's radar screen, unlike it had been in a long time. Because, with the election of Barack Obama, people thought we were post-race. Things are hunky-dory, kumbaya. And then we realized America is not what we said we were. So the book has come out at a time where polarization, and also and we see currently the political dynamics in terms of some regression on the rights of people of color, and also women's rights in terms of their equality and having control of their bodies. So in a sense, this book comes at a new time, but the data, here's the part that's interesting. Even though the book is coming in a different context, it does show that in the last 20 years, very little has changed for Black women and women of color.
Right.
We cite a statistic, in terms of Black and women of color getting into the senior leadership roles.
Right.
And when the book was issued, their representation was about 1.1%. Guess what? It's only gone up to 1.4.
Right.
So we're stagnated. There's stagnation. So we hope now that there's a sense of urgency.
Right.
And we'll talk more about that. I mean, we can be optimistic. We can be optimistic, because I said one thing we say in the book is that to hear corporate executives say the words systemic racism, that's an advancement. That's not something we heard.
That's progress. And I think, to your point, for the past 20 years, it's stagnant because while we weren't talking about it, it was still present.
Oh, yes.
There was no change that was taking place. It was still present. We're just talking about it now. You all know that in the green room, when we were talking, when we sat down, one of the first questions, because I was anticipating what people might ask, is the conversation started. The topic is Black and white women in the workplace, but we have 3 women who identify as Black having this conversation. What's your perspective on that? Are we credible? Can we have this conversation without a white woman here at the table? Or this is about Black and white women, but I also want to talk about the needs and differences of all of us But talk to me first about that. Are we credible without a white woman here?
You know, we went through, Stella was already tenured when this book came out. I wasn't. So what I heard, if you write this book, you'll never get tenure. If you write this book, you do this research, you'll never get a job. You know, God tells me what to do. And I was very clear about that. Yes, we have permission to write. We're reporting out on data. We're reporting it on accurately and reliability to make sure those standards are in there. We had a cross-racial team to look at the data. Yes, we were the principal investigators, but our research team was integrated with white women. We also had people review the data who happened to be white women. I don't think we need permission to do relevant, important, and we waited for permission, we'd be in real bad shape, number one.
Right.
The other thing, and I don't know if Stella felt the impact like I did because she was in South Africa. I was here, and I remember, you know, being on the road promoting the book, and I did the women's conference at Columbia's Business School. And there was a Asian Indian woman who raised her hand and said to me, "You're my role model." Kind of looked, you know, and said, "Huh?" And she said, at that time I had blonde dreadlocks. She said, "You got dreadlocks and you're in a top tier business school."
Right.
This woman had a nose ring for religious purposes.
Right.
Her people were telling her at Columbia, take the nose ring off, because when you go out on your interviews, you don't want anybody to think you're using drugs. You don't want anybody to think, you know, and it went on and on. And I said, "Girl, put your nose ring in.
Right.
Explain what that nose ring is about."
Right.
And if they don't honor that, then that's not the company for you.
Right.
I say that, I give that as an example because I think when you talk about the way that women of color, brown women, black women, immigrant women, Middle Eastern women, older women are cast on the sideline, are not considered to be worthy of leadership positions, while there are nuances in their stories, there's a lot of commonality in those stories in terms of not being accepted, not being invited into the network, not getting sponsorship, not getting the kinds of visibility that they need, and all of them feeling that they can't be themselves in the workplace.
Correct.
Now, the feeling that the question is, why do African American women continue to remain at the bottom of that list of women of color?
Stella, do you have a perspective?
Well, I was the point about permission. You know, one of the realities of being a Black person in this world is that we have to know about the other group.
Correct.
Because if we don't, we would not have survived.
Correct.
So in the sense of, you know, we have to learn and understand the behaviors of people who don't look like us in order for our survival. And actually, Lisa, in our book, we found that because we asked the women about learning about race. And our white women said, well, it wasn't on my radar screen.
Because it didn't have to.
I didn't have to. It wasn't on my consciousness.
Right.
You know, so that's part of it. But as Ella said, we are trained academics. So we are using good research methods. And so in that sense, but we got a lot of questioning about whether or not we were too biased. Were we doing hard work? So our colleagues, particularly our white male colleagues, were very suspicious of whether or not we could speak with authority. And that's still an issue, Lisa, that we picked up, you know, after we did our separate ways. With Ella started this wonderful program that I was part of, Ascent. And as we were teaching multicultural women and to hear the same stories, and particularly how their authority and knowledge was continually questioned. Are you really the person in charge? Did you get this job because of affirmative action? Are you a token? So this issue of women of color having the authority to study, to make decisions is still an issue for people who are Black, brown, immigrant. We are questioned, do we have the knowledge and authority to do whatever?
I've been spending a lot, amen. I have been spending a lot of time in the past few months thinking about assumptions and the role that assumptions play in the decisions that we make. And when many of our colleagues, either because of their race or because of their gender or because of their sexual orientation, walk into a room and there's an assumption made that they are in charge. There is an assumption made that they are competent. There's an assumption made that they are good. And for women, particularly women of color, and as a colleague of mine often points out, women of color who don't have the look, a woman who wears her hair natural, a woman who wears dreads, a woman who doesn't have the look. When that person walks into a room, you're spending all your time trying to gain and garner that confidence so you can even have a conversation. I hope she is listening now, but I did a call with a very senior ranking woman in an industry where women are not necessarily represented and women of color are absolutely not represented. And she shared a story about managing a multi-billion-dollar international deal. And when she walked in the room, it was clear that they expected her to get the coffee, to get the, and this, this happened, my mother talked about this happening 50 years ago, and it happens now. It happens now. It was revealed earlier, though you all were kind enough to not call me out on it, that I have not read the book, because a couple of times, just to our listeners, I asked a couple of questions, and Stella and Ella both were like, well, in chapter 4, and I was like, okay, I haven't read the book. So
sorry, Lisa.
I'm expecting a beautiful signed copy from the two of you to arrive at my home within minutes of this conversation. But because I didn't read the book, what are the 4 things that you want our listeners to know about and to hear? So we talked about the problems, we talked about the unfair assumptions, but what are the things that women can do to support each other in the workplace, regardless of where they come from? We didn't talk about ideology. We didn't talk about class. We didn't talk about sexual orientation a little bit. But in this recognition that women are different. You know what? We're just as different. Like when people say the category, well, women feel, I'm like, you don't know what I feel. Because you don't know all of the different elements about me. So, but what are, from a practical nature, what are the 4 or 5 things that women can do to be supportive of each other in the workplace, regardless of how they got to the position that they're in? Alex, 2 for you, Stella, 2 for you.
Okay. First of all, some things have changed since we wrote this book, which goes into what I'm about to say. I think there are more white women who are aware than when this book came out and we started working on this 30 years ago. So I've got to give, not all, but many of them are beginning to have awareness. I would say that for a woman to succeed in the workplace right now, something we call gig. She's got to have what we've learned from the women. Because if we know what gets in a woman's way, particularly Black women, in terms of advancing, then we can flip that and also say, well, we know what it takes for a woman to advance until systems change.
Right.
Okay, systems need to change. Let's get real clear about that. But in the meantime, I call it gig. Grit, influence, and grace. Gotta have grit. You've got to have bounceability. When somebody knocks you down, you have got to bounce back up. You've got to have the grit not to take it personally. You've got to have the self-awareness that it's not always about you. Rarely is it about you. And you've got to have the stamina to keep going no matter what. And don't second guess yourself. You've got to have the grit. You've got to have that grittiness. But with the grit, you also have to have influence. And I don't use the word power because when all women use the word power, around each other and particularly around men, regardless of their race, you get in trouble for that. Okay, so why fight something you don't need to fight? So let's talk about influence and how you can influence. Influence means what's your network? Influence means you know your data. You know what's up. You really understand what's going on. You've done your research. You have to know your data. You have to know your culture. You have to understand what's your strategy to influence. It's not just, here's my business card and aren't I cute? Has nothing to do with that. And what's your network, both internally and externally? And finally, grace. Grace is so important. You've got to accept people where they are. You have got to realize that you've got to be able to forgive. You've got to be able to be self-forgiving. You've got to have compassion and you've got to have empathy. I'm not saying you have to be a sucker. Okay, that's not what I'm saying. But you're not going to get it if you're the angry Black woman. So, I mean, that's 3 things.
That's some real talk. Saying that, that's some real talk because that's not something we can always hear.
No.
And sometimes that is used against us. It's like, well, why am I angry and Brooke is not? Brooke is just as pissed off as I am, but we're focused on me as an angry Black woman, and Brooke is like just has an opinion. So, but that's a second conversation. That's another LinkedIn Live because
if Black women are not smiling, they're angry.
Right.
Okay. If I'm not showing my teeth, then what's wrong with me? And that's outrageous.
Yeah. And I have an attitude.
Stereotype that still lives. And then if I had to add one more quick thing, you've got to have co-conspirators, not allies.
Yes.
People that are willing to get in there, strategize with you, put their lives on the line. What we do, we always, as Black women, put our lives on the line. We're willing to speak out and fight and go, It's got to be equal in that. For all women to be able to come in, what's the strategy? What are you willing to give up? Okay. And recognizing that when you co-conspire, when you really say we've had enough and this is how we're going to go about making change with grace.
Yes.
Then you finally begin to see things change.
Stella, I'm going to give you the last word. We clearly needed an hour. This always happens. We needed an hour. You have to come back and we'll do it again. Stella, but let me give you the last word.
Well, I think that I would say this is the time for women to really work for gender and racial equality. So we see that there are 41 women now heading Fortune 500 companies. And I would say to them, use that to influence the change you want to see. If you get a seat at that table as a woman of color, white woman, Latino woman, you need to ask, where are the rest of us? And us in the big sense. And if we don't use that influence to make change, if we don't do it, who's going to do it? So women must lead the change that they want to see. I'm not letting other people off the hook, but it's most important to us. So there can never be gender equality, truly, unless there's race and gender equality. Until all of us get through that wall, that barrier, none of us will ever be fully included. So we have to be much more collaborative and much more aware of how we need to work for change that we want to see in terms of gender and racial equality in the workplace and in the world.
I am, look, the sun has come in on me because this is an ordained conversation. How about that? Like this, I couldn't even stand this. This is clearly an ordained conversation because the sun has come beaming in on me because you all have illuminated my thinking, which I thought was already pretty sound and progressive, but I have learned a lot in this conversation. I have been personally and professionally inspired in this conversation. We will stay together with you. We will be your co-conspirators. We will lean into that grit, that influence, and that grace. And when you write the sequel, We're going to have you back on and talk about what's next. I think on behalf of everyone listening, thank you so much for sharing yourselves, your beauty, your intelligence, your commitment, your persistence to make us a better place to be. Thank you both very, very much. Thank you, everybody, for joining.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you, Lisa, for inviting us.
Yes.
My pleasure.
Take care, everyone.